Hey guys, it's Alex, and today I'm here with a review for All Your Perfects by Colleen Hoover. This is an adult romance novel about Graham and Quinn, a young 30-something married couple who are having marital problems. The story is told in dual timelines, first at the beginning of their relationship as they meet and start to fall in love, and then towards the end in the future where they're married and experiencing a lot of difficulties. Colleen Hoover is very well known in the new adult romance genre, and I'd never read her before. This book is a little bit more adult than her other works, I believe. This was my first foray into her work, and I'm disappointed to say that I gave this book 1 star. And I feel a little bit bad saying that because I don't think this book was truly horrific or anything like that. I didn't like it, but I didn't think it was terrible. It's just that when I was writing my review for this book, I had very little positive to say about it. There was nothing that I got out of this book. There was nothing that really spoke to me as a reader. There was nothing I really enjoyed. It was a book that I didn't think was terrible, but I personally got absolutely nothing out of this, although I could see where other people would. My biggest issue in this book is that although Quinn and Graham are having marital problems, and that's discussed pretty heavily in the summary, this book is about their marital problems. It's about sort of the breakup of their marriage almost. It never specifies why they're having problems. So I went in thinking it would be typical marriage problems. They'd have some specific issues, but overall they'd be growing apart. But that wasn't really the case. They have one issue in their marriage, and that's that Quinn's infertile but desperately wants to get pregnant. So a good portion of this book is about her wanting to get pregnant. Pretty much all of their problems stem from the fact that Quinn so desperately wants to become pregnant and can't. They've tried a number of options, everything from adoption to IVF, and nothing has worked. It's been 7 years, and at the time the story begins, they've given up, both on Quinn becoming pregnant and on their marriage. I don't think I would have picked this book up had I known it was so centered around Quinn's infertility problems, because I don't care. I understand that that's a topic a number of people might be interested in, and it probably wouldn't have bothered me so much had I seen any description about this, either on the Inside Flat or in people talking about this book, but there was nothing to really warn me of this, so I went in just knowing it was about their marital problems, and I really wish I'd had some sort of warning so that I could have known this book wasn't for me. Because I don't ever wish to have kids, so that's not something I can relate to, nor is it something I particularly care to read about. And I just wish I'd known that going in so I could have picked up a different Colleen Hoover book. I will also say that despite my not instinctively relating to this story on any level, Colleen Hoover also did not write this in a way that made me relate to Quinn or any of Quinn's problems, and I do think that was a flaw in her as a writer, rather than just the topic of the story, but I do think it would have been a stretch for me to really care about this at all from the very beginning. And I do think when books have a specific issue like that that drives the story, it's not the only point of the story, but it's talked about in pretty much every chapter. I really do think that's something that needs to be included in the summary on the inside flap, somewhere so that people know that's specifically what this book is about. It plays a major role in this book. Before I get too far into my other thoughts on this story, I figured I would give you the positives because there were so very, very few, and I feel bad that there were so few, but this story obviously was not for me from the beginning. First of all, it was very quick. I read it in pretty much one sitting. It was kind of one of those books where once I realized I wasn't going to get into it, I kind of just decided to read it as fast as possible to get it over with. It went by very quickly. It was a very easy read. Not necessarily enjoyable, but very quick and very easy. And the other thing that was a positive was that I really liked Quinn's mother. And I feel like that's only sort of a positive because we weren't meant to like Quinn's mother in this book. I'm fairly certain we were not meant to like Quinn's mother at all. But she kept saying really funny things that were incredibly relatable. There was one line about how all men are cheaters, but at least if you'd married Ethan, you would have married a rich cheater. And I get that we were supposed to think that was insensitive and kind of cruel, but it made me laugh. I thought that was very funny and relatable. And I kind of did like her mother's character, but I feel like that almost doesn't count in the book's favor because we weren't supposed to like her mother's character. I kind of thought she was awesome, and I kind of thought she was me. In the future, perhaps. Back into the negatives, I'm going to start with the writing style. I really don't like first-person present tense novels very much. There are a number that I do like that are written like that, but it's always a struggle for me to get over that, and I felt like it was really not for me in this book. not only is it first person present tense, but you spend a lot of time in Quinn's inner thoughts. She spends a lot of time musing about everything, about her relationship, about what she's wondering at the moment, about how things have been in the past and how they are now and why they are the way they are, and what she hopes for in the future and what she regrets from the past. And she just sits here thinking about everything and not actually reacting to anything that's going on in the story. It seemed like there was so little action because 2/3 of the story was just her being all caught up in her thoughts. And that's the thing that I dislike about first person present tense the most, is that it's so easy for authors to get caught up in the characters' thinking that we actually miss out on the story and the action that's happening around them. And when I say action, I don't mean like big dramatic action scenes. I mean literally like someone speaking is an action. Anything that happens physically in the story is an action. And I felt like we were missing out on that because Quinn was just sitting there thinking about her entire life. And I wasn't particularly interested in just hearing this woman think about her entire life. And one of the problems that resulted from that was that Quinn seemed to have an exceptionally good understanding of why things were the way they were, why she was reacting the way she was reacting, what the problems in her marriage were. And that's fine, like everything was explained in great detail, probably more than I needed. I could understand that for myself. I feel like I could have leapt to more conclusions than the author really let me, but that's fine. But because Quinn had this very nuanced understanding and was explaining to the reader every tiny detail of why things were the way they were, it felt like she really shouldn't have had that big of a problem in her marriage. It felt like had she opened her mouth and said half of what she was thinking to her husband, most of their problems would have been solved pretty easily, because this book kind of hinged on communication and the fact that they literally just stopped talking to each other, and they had all these issues because they weren't talking to each other. And I really didn't care because Quinn had 90% of the answers. Like, obviously, her infertility could not be solved, but the way they both felt about it could be. And Quinn had all these answers and all these explanations and reasons in her head that she was thinking and telling us, but she never told her husband, and I found that incredibly frustrating. Quick example, she recoils from his touch. Every time she touches her, it makes her flinch, she pulls away, she pushes him away. And she explains to us in great detail how she does this because when he touches her, it leads to sex. Even if it's not a sexual touch, it will eventually lead to sex, which leads to her feeling bad because to her, sex is trying to have a baby, which she's failing at. And that's fine. That makes sense. But she'll explain that to us in great detail. I sort of summed that up, but you know, in the book that take like a page or two for her to explain, all in her thoughts. And then she wouldn't say that to her husband. And it's like, this is why you're having problems. Like, just tell your husband that and start to work on it. And at one point she says they went to therapy, but therapy didn't work because their main problem was infertility. And it's like, no, it's not. It's communication. Just tell him what you're feeling and he could tell you what you're feeling and 90% of it is solved. And that's frustrating to me. I do like romance books and I do like to read about romance. But when the romance and the relationship and staying together is the main focal point of the story, it can't all just be hinged on communication issues like it was in this book, because it felt like there wasn't enough there. There weren't enough problems in the relationship, it kind of felt like. It was all too easily solved once it got to the end. And it was just frustrating to read because if they'd had this conversation 7 years earlier, everything would have been fine, because all it took was really one conversation to solve 90% of their problems. I also don't think the past-present dual timeline really worked for me. It felt like two completely different stories. Like Colleen Hoover was writing two separate books. She had one about this really cute couple that met in this really neat, cute way when their significant others were both cheating on them together. And she had this other story about a marriage that was breaking up, but she realized she didn't have enough plot for either, so she sort of put them together. And it really didn't make sense. Like, I didn't feel like the build-up of their relationship had really anything to do with the failure of their relationship, apart from being like, oh, these two people were once in love, and now they have a lot of issues. The only reason it seemed to be there was because there wasn't enough story. The only reason it seemed to be there was because there wasn't enough story in either the past or the present to carry an entire book on its own, and it just felt like a lazy way to turn this into a book for me. I had a lot fewer issues with the beginning of their relationship, actually, and I felt that would have made for a cute romance novel. It was just that the two together just felt entirely separate, and they never felt like they were cohesive in any way. I didn't really sympathize with Quinn for a lot of the book. Like, I do understand that part of that does probably come from me not relating to her situation, and not particularly caring about her infertility problems. Like, it's sad, but it's not something I particularly care to read about, and would not have if there had been any information in the summary about this book and the infertility problems. I felt like she was being particularly cruel to Graham for a good portion of this book when he wasn't really doing anything wrong. It seemed like, for a good portion of the book, she had most of their relationship issues covered by herself. And if she just said that she was feeling bad, she said she was feeling guilty or sad or whatever, a lot could have been solved. Only she never talked. She would just literally push him away constantly and use him for sex and make him feel really horrible. And I'm not using this to excuse any of his later behavior, because most of this note I wrote early on before he started acting really poorly. But it just seemed like the both of them, by the end of the book, were just treating each other so horribly that I honestly did not want them to be together. And it's not really a good romance novel when I don't want the main characters to be together because they don't seem like they work well together. The part we got at the beginning of their relationship being built up was all in the first couple of months of their relationship. And it felt like by the time they'd spent a few years together, they actually found out they didn't work well together. And I didn't buy that they could be a long-term couple. And I think that's a major flaw in a romance novel, is making you believe that the main couple isn't going to work. The small point that really didn't bother me so much in this book because it wasn't a major focal point, the box that they've agreed to open whenever they've decided to get a divorce. I didn't like the use of the box and how secretive it was, and how a lot of this novel was like hinged on, ooh, what's the box? Let's wait and see. We're going to have to open the box in the end. That always feels really lazy to me when it comes to books. It happens a lot in thrillers, and it's just one of those cheap ways to get your reader to stay interested in the story when you lack interesting characters or an interesting plot. And I didn't like the use of it in this story. And my final point, which is honestly the reason that this book got 1 star instead of 2 stars, is the ending. The ending was incredibly preachy, to the point of ridiculousness. The whole ending was just an explanation on why communication is important and how no relationship can be strong without communication, and you have to talk to each other about your feelings and your fears and the issues you're having, and it's like, duh. This book is geared towards adults. I think most adults are well aware of that by now. We don't need a 300-page book to teach us that communication is important in relationships. We don't all do it, but we know it's important, and I don't need to sit through a book that's just explaining to me why it's important. If it had been less preachy and just about them communicating, that would have been fine. But at one point it felt like she was talking directly to the reader and explaining why communication problems ruin most relationships. And that just made me shrivel up and cringe inside. Also, the ending in general was just really, really boring. There were a lot of letters and long passages at the end that Quinn had to read, and it was so boring. I had to try my hardest not to just skim through those because I really did not care. I had absolutely zero interest, and when I'm trying not to skim through the climax of this story, that's really a problem. I was just bored. There were points in the story where I almost thought some of the dialogue was a little bit humorous, but those points were few and far between, and mostly I felt bored. I just wanted it to be over, and I read it very, very quickly so that it would be over. I can definitely see where other people might like this book a lot more than I did. I just wish I'd known going in more of what it was actually about. It does really bother me that there was no mention of infertility on the front jacket or any of the descriptions. That seems like a major oversight in the marketing of this book. Because A, you have an entire market there of people who want to read about this topic specifically, but you also have a lot of people like me who just have no interest. I kind of feel cheated out of a story when I didn't know that going in. Overall, just a 1-star read. I got nothing out of this book. I didn't think it was the worst thing ever, but when I get absolutely nothing out of a reading experience, I can't justify giving this book a 2nd star. Although I do think if it sounds interesting to you, and if you do generally like romance novels, this book might be something that's worthwhile to pick up. It was just, for me, it made a lot of choices that I really did not like. I don't think I'll be reading any more of her work, just because now that I've read this one, no, I didn't like the story so much, but I also didn't like her writing style or her storytelling, and unless I hear that that's very, very different in other books, I don't think I'll be picking up any more of her books. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see y'all again soon.